All right. Dr. Kathryn Weathersby, are you ready to rock?
I am.
Hello and welcome to the Korea Society. My name is Jonathan Corrado. I'm the policy director here. The title of today's program is The Moscow-Pyongyang Connection. We tried to make it very much like a spy novel.
Good idea.
And it's a timely occasion to gather on this particular topic because just now we see North Korean troops gathering within Russia, prepared to enter the war in the Ukraine. So we're so lucky to have you here today to shed some insight on the deeper historical roots of this relationship and what it suggests about the context for what's happening right now. So thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
So let me introduce you a little bit more formally. Dr. Kathryn Weathersby is Adjunct Professor of Asian Studies at the Wall School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, my alma mater, a wonderful school indeed. She's a specialist on the Korean War and the history of North Korea. She conducted pioneering research in the Russian archives on the establishment of the DPRK and the Korean War, a place that unfortunately would be difficult to go back to today, the Russian archives, I mean. Yeah. But we're so glad that you were able to go at that point and get that information for us. So let's start with the North Korea-Russia treaty, which we saw come out earlier this year. And I kind of was hoping that you could tell us how much this changes the status quo of Russia-North Korea relations that's been in place since about the end of the Cold War. So what does this mean? This treaty that just came out, what does it tell us?
It's a super significant treaty, I think. One way to look at it is that it undoes the damage, enormous damage that was done to North Korea's interest in 1990, 1991, really beginning with 89, 90, 91, a series of just catastrophic events for the North that left it isolated, poorer than it had ever been, resulting in the terrible famine of the 90s, but also diplomatically isolated, losing their main source of military hardware, all kinds of things. So it's useful to look at what happened in 89,
So you think this
91.
happens earlier than the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
Yes, absolutely. Dissolution of the Soviet Union was the last step.
Mm-hmm.
But before that was the successful Olympics in Seoul in 88, which brought the whole world to Seoul, right, for the first time. It was the biggest Olympics ever, greatest number of countries involved. And North Korea tried to sabotage that by blowing up an airplane a year earlier to make people afraid to go to Seoul, but it did not work. They particularly did not want their fraternal states in the communist world to go to Seoul, but they failed to dissuade them against doing that. So they went, and lo and behold, the Soviets discovered a modern, thriving, wealthy, exuberant country just at the same time that the leadership under Gorbachev was beginning to get pretty desperate about Soviet finances as his economic reforms were not bearing fruit immediately. And so following the Olympics, which were very heavily covered in the Soviet Union, he instructed his advisors to pursue the possibility of a loan from South Korea, a loan and also just outright cash grant. So they did, and all of that came about very quickly because the South was already eagerly pursuing what it called Nordpolitik, named after Ostpolitik in West Germany. So they already had established diplomatic relations with Hungary right before the Olympics began.
So North Korea making friends with all of North Korea's friends.
That's right. South Korea was actively pursuing a policy of establishing relations with North Korea's allies in order to put pressure on North Korea to moderate its behavior, to come out into the international arena, so to speak. And so the first target of that was Hungary, which was successful. And then after the Olympics, then they jumped very quickly on doing the same thing with the Soviet Union. It's an extraordinary moment, really. I love to think about this moment in 1990 because, of course, it was the Soviet Union that created North Korea, right? That divided Korea together with the United States. And so for the Soviet Union to abandon North Korea in favor of Seoul because it needed money is about as, shocking a turn of events as you can possibly imagine.
So in a sense, Russia's saying, North Korea, you've become a liability, and South Korea, you're a potential source of wealth for us.
Right.
That's going to motivate. So the geopolitical considerations become a little less important.
Well, it was for the Soviets, it was all about money at that time. They were sending about $1.5 billion per year in goods to North Korea and getting about less than $1 billion in payment of any kind, in kind or cash. So North Korea was a drain financially. But also Gorbachev had made a shift in his thinking by the end of 1988, making statements such as that the world is now interdependent. We can no longer talk about two camps. We can no longer even talk about a closed society. So he intellectually was ready to give up on North Korea, but then the actual change in policy happened because of a desperate need of money. So Seoul is not going to give $1.5 billion in cash and $1 billion in credits and $500 million in capital goods for nothing. Right. So what the Soviets had to do in exchange for that was stop sending military assistance to the North. Well, this not only weakened the North Korean military, naturally enough, but also they had basically a concession from the Soviet Union for decades, which allowed them to resell, right? A lot of the military hardware they got from the Soviet Union to sell it in places like Syria, or, anywhere else who would buy it from them. That was their main source of hard currency. So they suddenly were cut off from military supplies, which they had relied on since the KPA was created, but also they were cut off from a source of hard currency. And then it got even worse when they responded in person to the news of this arrangement when the Soviet foreign minister went to Pyongyang by issuing threats to the Soviet Union. So, because at this time, the Gorbachev government was also faced with demands for independence from several of the republics of the Soviet Union. His primary concern was to keep the Union together and have it not break apart. And so North Korea said, well, you recognize Seoul, we will feel free to recognize the independence of Kazakhstan or Georgia. Take that, right? And furthermore, we will feel free to develop whatever weapons we feel we need. We will not be constrained by you. And so Moscow was so offended by those threats that they decided to cut off oil deliveries to North Korea. So not only were they losing military supplies, they were losing oil, which had been delivered at below market prices and not paid for in hard currency. So now they said, if you want our oil, you have to pay for it in hard currency at world market prices, which they couldn't do, and so the economy in North Korea imploded.
So let's get to the treaty. So with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the new Russian Federation will not renew the Mutual Defense Treaty. They won't keep that alive. And so North Korea only has its Mutual Defense Treaty with the PRC for a period of 3 decades.
That's right.
Until earlier this year, when it once again has another Mutual Defense Treaty. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, that's such a better situation. To be so dependent on relations with one country, as they have been for the last 30 years with China, means that China has way too much leverage, right, over North Korea, which is a very uncomfortable situation for North Korea. So now they can get some of what they need from Russia, right? And they can begin to a certain degree, play Russia and China off one another. So will be a bit different dynamic than what they had after 1960 with the Sino-Soviet split, but essentially the same thing. They have 2 patrons rather than 1. Right. And those 2 patrons don't have identical interest.
And that tension between the 2 patrons is actually a good source of leverage for North Korea to get concessions.
Exactly. So North Korea is very skilled at doing this, and they can get what they need. But also, Russia needs North Korea, right, for the first time since perhaps 1950.
The Korean War, right.
So now North Korea is in a position to get concessions from Russia because it is providing ammunition and parts. It's kind of remarkable how much ammunition it has.
I heard an analysis, $5.5 billion worth of missiles, artillery, everything that they've given thus far. That's not to include the manpower, right? I don't know how you quantify that, but...
Plus the man, it's surprising, I think, to a lot of people how much North Korean industry has been able to produce. It also means that North Korea can train its forces, some of its forces. According to reports, it's the elite forces who have been sent. And so that's extremely helpful. Their military has not participated in military action since 1953.
And prior to this, in our lunch discussion, you mentioned how the PLA had a similar motivation for keeping the Korean War going, to give their units some combat experience.
Interestingly enough, yes, China did exactly the same thing during the Korean War. China's military before the Korean War was a guerrilla army. It was an extremely good guerrilla army, very effective, but nonetheless a guerrilla army, not a modern industrialized army. But once the front stabilized in Korea, the Soviets began a very intensive training program, basically, transforming the Chinese army into a modern, industrialized army. So they delivered not only weapons and people to train them in the weapons, but also people to set up a logistical system that worked, for the Chinese forces, a communication system, all of these things that it lacked before. And Mao was, of course, very happy about that. He cycled through units of the PLA from all over China to spend some months in Korea to get the benefit of this very excellent military school.
So the PRC has this motivation to keep the fighting going. The Soviet Union does as well. And you mentioned earlier today as well that Kim Il-sung had a motivation to end things.
Yes. I think what happened during the Korean War is quite a relevant point of comparison for us today. It was the Soviets that allowed North Korea to begin the war, to attempt to reunify the country under their control, their primary aim. However, Soviet commitment to North Korea was distinctly limited. They were not going to do anything that would risk confrontation with the United States. So when the war turned against North Korea after the Incheon landing of September 15, 1950, and UN forces began moving into the north, the Chinese leadership for 2 weeks hesitated to send their forces to Korea, even though they had agreed they would do so before the war began. They hesitated for very sensible reasons, it seems to me, such as that they thought this was not a great idea for them, having just come out of decades of fighting, to engage in military conflict with the most powerful armies in the world.
Everyone else finished fighting World War II, 1945. China fighting continues in the Civil War until 1949.
Right.
Now, just a year after establishing the country, you're going after a nuclear-armed behemoth in the United States.
Yeah, exactly.
What gave them the courage to go forward with that? And with some reservations on the part of Stalin and giving the kind of protection that they were asking for.
Yeah, exactly. Well, China demanded that the Soviets provide air cover for their forces crossing the Yalu River bridges to enter North Korea. Very sensible, because soldiers on a bridge are easily spotted by American planes and could have very easily been strafed, as the U.S. had been strafing North Korean soldiers traveling on roads. So that was a kind of natural demand, but Stalin was not willing to do that because he so did not want Soviet Air Force to engage with American Air Force. He was really, really, really afraid.
His form of restraint.
Yes, that was his restraint. Number one priority was to make sure that the fighting in Korea did not escalate into war between Soviet Union and U.S.
But so long as Chinese and North Korean soldiers are dying, that's fine.
That's as long as it's not going to escalate into a war with the Soviet Union. So he said no to air cover, and finally China, after 2 weeks of deliberation, decided to send their forces in anyway, even without air cover, partly because they felt they needed to protect the Chinese border, reasonably enough. They also felt they had a blood debt to North Koreans who had fought with them for decades in North China. But
a lot of ethnic Koreans participating in the Civil War.
Well, yeah, and before that, in the war against Japan, and since the early 30s, actually, even before the war against Japan, Korean communists had been fighting together with Chinese communists in Manchuria and North China.
Yeah.
So, and tens of thousands of them. So there was that. But then the primary thing on Mao's part was that he was worried about revolutionary momentum waning in China following the establishment of the PRC. And so he thought fighting the world's most powerful, imperialist armies was just the thing to do.
So not that it would disturb morale, but that it would somehow whip everybody up into a frenzy.
It would build morale. This is just what we need to restore revolutionary momentum. I make fun of that, but in fact it worked.
Yeah.
It is what the war did in China. So who am I to make fun of that idea?
Yeah.
Anyway, but one thing that's relevant to today, I think, is that before the Chinese leadership finally made their decision to enter the war in Korea, when the Soviets were still not providing air cover, Mao and Stalin together agreed that in light of that situation, they would order Kim Il-sung to withdraw his remaining forces, which already were just up in the northernmost part of the country after the UN moved north very quickly, to withdraw his remaining forces into China.
Just a stunning request. Basically abandon your country.
Abandon your country. This was a directive from Stalin to Kim Il-sung that was delivered to him. The very next day, right, the Chinese decided to enter anyway, and so another telegram went down canceling the evacuation order. But you can just imagine, right? Kim Il-sung's mentor and protector, and the great, leader of the entire communist world, has decided to abandon.
Who kind of egged him on? Go ahead.
Right, egged him. Yeah, it's just a very, very shocking turn of events. I think Kim never recovered from that. His relationship to the Soviet Union changed after that event. So
this mutual distrust kind of continues. So I want to get to the armistice and how they all had diverging opinions, Soviet Union, China, and North Korea, on when and how the war should end.
Yes. So when the armistice negotiations began in the summer of 1951, after the line stabilized, the front line stabilized, when China's fifth offensive failed in June. So by that time, Stalin had already changed his view on the war in Korea. Instead of viewing it as potentially dangerous, as he had throughout 1950, he now, since China had stabilized the situation, in other words, pushed the Americans away from the Soviet border, from the Chinese border, he now looked at how the war could be useful to the Soviet Union. And decided to keep the war going for a couple of years in order to keep the Americans stuck in Korea, so that the East European communist bloc states, whose job it was to be a buffer, a security buffer for the Soviet Union, could build up their military forces to the point where they would be effective as a buffer. So let's keep the Americans stuck in Korea, bleed them for a couple of years while we build up our defenses. So
basically the start of satellite warfare and the whole pattern of the Cold War starts here in Korea.
That's right. That's right. And so he sent a directive to the Chinese and the North Korean negotiators at the armistice talks to go slow. Don't accept any terms that the American side puts forth. And they continued to do that. Kim Il-sung and the rest of the North Korean leadership, by early 1952, began to talk about how they wanted the war to end, because the bombing from the United States was so extensive.
Once again, lacking the Soviet air power protection that had been requested.
The Soviets did come in along the Yalu River after the Chinese began engaging with UN forces and beating them. Then Stalin decided to allow some of his air units to fly above the Yalu River. This was the so-called Mig Alley, as the American pilots dubbed it. And that continued throughout the war, with the Soviet planes bearing North Korean markers and Soviet pilots wearing North Korean uniforms. The Americans, of course, knew those were Soviet planes and Soviet pilots. They could hear them speaking Russian over the radio, but anyway, they knew that where that plane came from, where there were pilots who knew how to fly that plane.
All kinds of fiction coming from the other side, with the Chinese pretending to be North Korean units as well.
And so, but the Americans did not want war with the Soviet Union, just as the Soviets did not want war with the United States. And so the Americans just pretended this wasn't happening, right?
And MacArthur wants to go in there and bomb the bases where these MiGs are coming from.
He did initially, but then, of course, he was famously removed from his position in the spring of 1951. But this was actually the largest military conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union of the entire Cold War.
Wow.
Was the air war in Korea, but it was kept quiet. On the American side, journalists couldn't write about it.
Yeah.
It was completely hushed up that those were Soviet planes the Americans were encountering. And the Soviet pilots were very good. We never did take out those bridges over the Yalu. The Soviet fighter jet pilots the fighter jets were really good, and their pilots were really good. So it was quite a battle there over the Yalu. But the instructions Stalin gave to the Soviet air units prohibited them from flying over the rest of North Korean territory, only along the Yalu River corridor to protect the bridges, not over the rest of North Korea. And so American bombers had free range. There was nothing opposing them. They were very frustrated that the war was dragging on in what seemed to be unreasonable.
Public opinion turns against the war.
So they really want to end the war, so they just keep stepping up the bombing.
Yeah.
Just bomb and bomb and bomb. The same places were bombed over and over and over. The only places, basically, that were not heavily bombed were small towns or temples or monasteries or something that were in very narrow valleys that were too narrow for a plane to fly through.
Yeah.
Those were the only places that were safe. If it was possible for a plane to fly over it, they would, and that place was bombed. And the physical structures of North Korea were completely destroyed.
Kim Il-sung wants to end the war, not allowed.
Yeah, so Kim Il-sung, naturally enough, wants this to stop.
Yeah.
But Stalin says no. You have to keep fighting. Mao is the one who really elaborates for him how he needs to view the situation, giving him this kind of stern lecture as the communist older brother, how Kim Il-sung must understand the importance of Korea in the worldwide revolutionary movement. The strength of the Korean people is inspiring peace-loving peoples around the world, on and on and on, right? And so North Korea must keep fighting.
Basically told that your country's war doesn't serve you, it serves us.
Yes. You will keep fighting because your war is benefiting China, it's benefiting the Soviet Union, even though for you it is causing complete and utter destruction. We have the records of the communications during the armistice negotiations, lasted for 2 years. And the way it worked was that the response was formulated in Beijing, sent to the negotiators. If it was something particularly important, Beijing would send it first to Moscow for Stalin's opinion, then he would send it back to Beijing, and they would send it to the negotiators. Occasionally, they would inform Kim Il-sung, but usually not.
Wow.
And they never asked for his opinion.
Wow.
Occasionally, they would let him know. But most of the time, no.
Remarkable.
It is really amazing. And it was clear to the UN negotiators that the Chinese negotiator on the other side of the table was the one who had the power, not the North Korean one sitting next to him. So that was the chain of command during the armistice negotiations.
So I think I'd like to fast forward a few years. So after the Korean War ends, Kim Il-sung will have some very hard-learned lessons about his patrons, the Soviet Union and China.
Right.
And there's a dramatic shift after Stalin dies, and Khrushchev takes over and pursues de-Stalinization, which is quite threatening to the tin pot dictators of the communist world, like Kim Il-sung. And So how did that manifest? I understand that there was a bit of a upheaval in 1956 that Kim Il-sung
There
had to face.
was. This was another just really remarkable story. North Korea was rebuilt by the Soviet Union and the East European communist countries very quickly with just extraordinary levels of economic support and of people going there, all kinds of technicians. The place was rebuilt from the ground up much faster than the South was rebuilt. But the price for that was that North Korea had to follow Soviet policy lines. So in 1956, once Khrushchev had firmly consolidated his position as leader, he made a famous secret speech at the 20th Party Congress in February of that year, informing all of the communist parties of the world, right, which all had to follow Moscow's guidance at this point, that his goal was to end the tradition of cult of personality, because he believed that's what had allowed Stalin to improperly imprison and execute so many thousands of people. And so the new policy of the Soviet Communist Party, which is to be followed everywhere, is no more cult of personality. Also, Khrushchev had decided, because of the second generation of nuclear weapons that both the Soviets and the Americans had developed, that they could no longer think in terms of war with the United States. So they would have to shift to a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West. No more cult of personality, peaceful coexistence with the West.
Totally anathema to North Korea.
No. So very, very threatening to Kim Il-sung. He initially managed to get the North Korean Party, the Korean Workers' Party, to agree to adopt new policies that did not follow Khrushchev's guidance. But then when they did that, that was in August of 56, when they did that, the Soviet leadership and the Chinese leadership became so alarmed that North Korea was breaking ranks that they sent two people to Pyongyang to force the North Korean Party to hold a new plenum in September, at which Khrushchev's new policies would be adopted. They did that, right? But after that, and that, of course, was very humiliating to Kim Il-sung, but after they had done that, Kim Il-sung just slow-walked the implementation of the new policies. Just delayed. Meanwhile, in Hungary, a very serious uprising occurred, which snowballed and escalated into calls for Hungary to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. It became very anti-Soviet uprising. Soviet symbols were being torn down from buildings and so forth and so forth. Mao became so alarmed that he put pressure on Khrushchev to end the uprising in Hungary by using the Soviet army. So in the end, he did do that. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest. So when that happened, then there was no longer an appetite for forcing Kim Il-sung to follow Khrushchev's policies, because look what it had resulted in Hungary.
So what does the Kim regime learn from all this?
Well, first of all, and I think this is relevant to today as well, things are always changing, right? So the situation that exists now with Ukraine, the great benefit to North Korea that can come from the war in Ukraine, it's not going to last forever.
Yeah.
Right. These situations change. These policies change. So you make the most of it when you have the opportunity to, but don't trust in the relationship over the long term.
Yeah.
So this relationship is not built on shared values. It's not built on underlying trust. It's only built on quid pro quo.
Take advantage when the situation arises.
Right. What we would call today a transactional relationship. And then it was after Kim Il-sung got away with what he did in 1956 that he then moved to consolidate absolute power in North Korea to an extent he did not have before this. And so it's after that that he began his completely uncontested rule in North Korea. So it was very important. But then after the Sino-Soviet split just 4 years later, neither Beijing nor Moscow is going to bother him about his idiosyncratic approach.
And it's that tension between the China and the Soviet Union which gives Kim Il-sung the opportunity to extract that mutual defense treaty from both partners.
He gets a mutual defense treaty. He gets lots of military hardware. One particularly amazing example of this is in 1968 when he attempted to assassinate Park Chung-hee by sending the commandos to the Blue House. When that failed, he seized the USS Pueblo to try to distract attention from the failure of the Blue House raid. When he did that, without consulting the Soviets or anybody else, just totally on his own, the Soviets paid a high price for it. Because the Americans assumed that North Korea would not have done that without Soviet backing.
Interesting.
And so nuclear forces all around the Soviet border, all the way from Europe to the Near East to the Far East, went on high alert, assuming that the seizure of the Pueblo signaled that the Soviets were planning some new aggression. Right. In January of 1968. So Moscow was furious.
And that's the problem with allying with North Korea. You enable their provocation. So a similar case exists today, right?
Yes. They, as long as he can play Russia and China against one another, and as long as both of them have strong motivation for keeping North Korea going, right, then they have a scope. I mean, one of the amazing things about the seizure of the Pueblo is that a couple of months later, the Soviet Politburo asked Kim Il-sung to go to Moscow for discussions. Whoa. But remarkably,
this isn't good when you're asked to come for discussions.
No. But remarkably enough, he sent a reply saying, "I'm afraid I'm terribly busy. I'm too busy right now to go to Moscow myself. I am sending my defense chief." And so his poor defense chief had to go to Moscow to get yelled at. And then after the yelling stopped and they made it clear to him how completely inadmissible that behavior was of seizing the Pueblo, he simply listened and then pulled out of his pocket a list of the new weapons systems that the North Korea would like the Soviets to send them. And they did send them. Yeah, so that's... the ability to do that was so valuable. And that's what all ended in 1989 with the end of the Sino-Soviet split and the collapse of the fraternal countries in Eastern Europe. And then in 1990, when the Soviets turned to South Korea, unimaginable thing. Right. And then in 1991, when the Communist Party became illegal in Russia, what? And then a couple of months later, when the Soviet Union came apart into separate republics, all of that just completely crashed the world that North Korea had depended on. And so a useful way, I think, of looking at what has just happened this year is that a new situation has been created that provides North Korea support, protection, backing that they haven't had for 30 plus years. Yeah.
So just one quick comment and then a question, a follow-up to that. The story about the Pueblo reminds me of Park Hoon-young, who was asked by Kim Il-sung to make the argument to Stalin that there's going to be all these grassroots uprising. When we invade South Korea, the people there love communism. They're going to welcome us with open arms. There's going to be all these guerrillas running around, and hardly anyone's going to fight. It's going to be a cakewalk. War's over in 3 days.
Right.
But instead of making that pitch himself directly, Kim Il-sung, to Stalin, he says, Park Hoon-young, you know a lot about South Korean communism. Why don't you make... And then, of course, he has to mea culpa after the fact. So Kim Il-sung, quite a skilled politician. He knows what's a risky promise.
He was.
And so looking at things now, I know it's impossible to speculate what China's thinking about all this, right? The new North Korea-Russia relationship, but just putting on our historian hats. What might Xi Jinping be thinking about what's happening right now?
For one thing, he's worried about North Korea slipping out from under his thumb.
Yeah.
That's dangerous, right? Because China is very worried about getting dragged into conflicts it doesn't want to be dragged into by North Korea. It will do a lot of helping it evade sanctions, all kinds of financial goings on. It will allow and all kinds, but it does not want North Korea to start something that will blow up the region. That's part of it. Also, China, while it has become much more aggressive under Xi Jinping, its actions in the South China Sea with regard to Taiwan and so forth, still it is part of the broader international system to a greater extent than Russia is.
Yes.
China has such a hugely bigger economy, much bigger international economic presence. So it's wary about its new alliance with Russia, North Korea, and Iran, causing it to be harmed in ways that it doesn't want to. So it's
got more equity in the international system.
It does.
One thing that I think about is the Korean War started because Kim Il-sung could initiate his war of unification before Mao Zedong could finish his war of unification. And there was this feeling, maybe correct feeling, that America wouldn't stomach 2 communist invasions in Asia. Maybe 1, they'd overlook it. It would be okay. But 2, no way. And so it was a race between Mao and Kim Il-sung, and Kim Il-sung won the race, right? So is there any scope for an application of that today? Is it a positive thing from China's perspective that the U.S. and the Western world is distracted by Russia's invasion? Is that something that is giving them a little bit of space to think about Taiwan, for instance, that otherwise wouldn't normally apply? Or is this something that just consolidates the 2 competing camps in a way that's not helpful for China?
No, it does give them some space to the extent that the war in Ukraine goes badly, right? To the extent that the Western world gets tired of supporting Ukraine, that could give China, greater space. It really remains to be seen. I think surely, as was the case with the Korean War, of 1950, decisions were based on the signals of the entire international arena, not only Korean Peninsula, but the signals coming from American involvement in Western Europe, in the Near East, elsewhere. That's what shaped American involvement in the Korean War as well. So we have to look at the whole arena of Russian engagement and concerns along its borders, Iran's concerns with the Middle East, China's concerns many places, North Korea's concerns regarding South Korea. We have to look at all of that as being what will shape North Korean behavior.
And the historical insights that you've shared with us today certainly contribute to helping us to get a better grasp for what's going on. So we're so grateful that you came here today. Please, if you would help me to thank Dr. Kathryn Weathersby.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks for everyone watching us live. Join us back next Friday for Breaking Bad, South Korea's Nuclear Option with Dr. Victor Cha. We look forward to seeing you in person here at the Korea Society and online. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.